When I was 12 years old, my parents took my little sister and I to a fall fair just outside the city. We got bored when they started perusing the homemade butters and jams and split off on our own. We passed by a petting zoo and my little sister stopped to feed the goats. There was a pumpkin contest with several absurdly large pumpkins lined up in a row, but beyond them something caught my eye. A vast pumpkin patch just behind a thin row of trees in a farmer's field. I suspected that it might have been outside the bounds of the fairground, but I was curious and I couldn't stop myself. The pumpkin patch was guarded by a scarecrow. This one wasn't wearing flannel and straw. It was wearing a black leather trench coat and a top hat. Its face looked straw, but it was mostly shrouded by the brim of the hat. I can remember walking up to it, standing under it, and feeling creeped out. My little sister caught up to me. She was 10 years old at the time. "Ew, what is that?" she exclaimed as she nearly walked over a half-rotten pumpkin, detached from the vine. "You should throw it at the spooky man," she told me. I made the connection and realized she was talking about the scarecrow. "That's not a bad idea, Becca," I told her. I lifted the rotting pumpkin. It was actually pretty heavy, and I tossed it at the scarecrow. It deflected off the body, and straw shuddered and shook from its face. The pumpkin landed with a splat on the ground, but it maintained its shape. "Get it higher! Hit it in the head!" Becca cheered. Well, I realized it wasn't as fun as I thought it would be, but I didn't want to let her down. I picked up the pumpkin once again, and Granny tossed it high into the air. For a moment, it promised to clear the head of the scarecrow, but then sailed back down directly on top of it. The pumpkin's outer shell was just soft enough to envelop the top hat and straw head of the scarecrow, and with a satisfying wet thunk, it fixed itself around the scarecrow's neck, replacing its head. Becca and I laughed, and our father called us. "Get out of that field! That's not the fairground!" We sheepishly made our way back to the fair, and spent the rest of the afternoon somewhat bored. We loaded into the car as dusk fell, and I peered out my window as we drove by the field. I saw the pumpkin patch, and I looked for the scarecrow, but it was gone. I was sure that I was looking at the right spot, just 10 or 20 meters out from the fairground, but nope, it simply wasn't there. I had trouble sleeping that night. I felt hot, and I tossed and turned. I hated the way our house creaked at night, and I had no phone, no way of telling the time, no way of knowing how close I was to morning. I gave up temporarily and sat up in bed. I had found over the years that sometimes, if you couldn't get to sleep, it was better to just do something else for a little while. I had a habit of looking out my bedroom window at the stillness of our backyard. It filled me with a sense of calm. It was always peaceful. Sometimes I'd see night wildlife like opossums and raccoons. But tonight, there was no wildlife. My eyes traced from the porch, lit by the dull glow of the living room light, out into the yard. In my peripheral vision, I noticed something out of the ordinary. My eyes darted over to the above-ground fire pit to see something monstrous looming over it. It was the scarecrow from the field, pumpkin still adorning its head. It had no face, but I felt like it was looking at me. The pumpkin was just angled in such a way. I slunk back down into my bed and rubbed my eyes. I refused to believe it was real, and I wouldn't have known what to think if it was. A part of me wondered if I was dreaming, and the thought that I might have already been asleep was what I needed to get to sleep. I awoke in the night to a burning sensation enveloping my entire body. I had never felt this hot before in my life. I tried to move, but I was pinned to my bed. I was covered with something. It felt like a scalding hot wire had been wrapped around my body. I looked down in the darkness. There was just enough light to make them out. They were vines. It took a moment for my panic to kick in, and when it did, it was furious. I screamed as I struggled to break myself free. The vines were growing quickly and seemed to replace themselves just after I ripped them off a part of my body. I grasped the vines around my neck and spun with them as hard as I could. I managed to break free of the bed and fell over the side. The vines released me, and I sat on all fours, panting for a moment. physically and mentally exhausted. Screaming started from Becca's room, and I bolted out my door and over to her. Not only were vines holding her fast to her bed, but a pumpkin had grown over her head. It had a jack-o'-lantern's face carved into it, and light and smoke were pouring out of the holes. I recognized the smell from my mom's curling iron, burning hair. I rushed over to her and tried to rip the pumpkin off her head, but it scalded my hands when I touched it. I could see her through the holes in the jack-o'-lantern's face. Her skin was burning, melting. Every time she managed to get her hands free and tried to lift the pumpkin off her own head, the vines grew back over her wrists and pinned her helplessly again. Our parents rushed into the room and pushed me aside as they tried all the things I just had. For a moment, I felt hopeless, but I couldn't allow my sister to die like this. In the back of my mind, I knew what was causing this. I faced my fears and ran to the back door and out into the backyard to see the scarecrow still there, motionless, staring at the bedroom windows with its vacant face. I jumped and kicked it solidly in the torso. The stick holding it up from the ground tipped, and the object collapsed over, but still I heard my little sister's screams flooding out into the night from her room. I knew what I had to do. I reached for the pumpkin on the scarecrow's head. To my surprise, it was burning hot like the one on my sister's, and I pulled my hands away, instead deciding to strike at it, breaking it apart, mushing the rotten pumpkin until there was nothing left but the exposed straw face of the scarecrow and its wide-brimmed black top hat. The screams from inside stopped, and for a moment I worried my sister was dead. I ran back inside to find that my parents had succeeded in removing the jack-o'-lantern from her head, but she was bald now, cinders of hair still glowing, face partially melted and skin covered in third-degree burns. My parents rushed her to the hospital, and she survived, but while I was home alone, in the remainder of that night, I watched the toppled scarecrow from out the window. It lay lifeless for an hour or two, but at 3 a.m., its jacket started to billow in the breeze. It was changing, morphing into something, and it rose to its feet to greet me. It was a man. He was 7 feet tall. He still wore that black trench coat and top hat, but I couldn't see his eyes, only his smile. Vines emerged from the ground, little pumpkins hanging off them. They wrapped around his body and pulled him into the earth.